Not since Prime Minister Mulroney and President Reagan crooned, "When Irish eyes are smiling," has the binational collegiality hit the heights seen this week when President Obama and much of the rest of America greeted Prime Minister Trudeau in the U.S. Capitol. So, will the budding bromance matter in substance? Joining us tonight from Washington, D.C., Scotty Greenwood. She is Senior Advisor to the Canadian American Business Council and a Principal in Denton's Public Policy and Regulation Practice. And James Munson, a reporter with iPolitics, and it's great to have you two on the program. James, for the first time, and Scotty, great to see you again. Should I let the cat out of the bag here, Scotty? You haven't been to bed yet, have you? It's been a great night.
It's been a great week.
It
really
a great
has,
week.
And it's yeah.
Here's
terrific.
a little snippet of it, and then we'll come back and chat. President Obama welcoming
Thanks.
the Prime Minister of Canada. Roll tape.
Mr. Prime Minister, your election and the first few months in office have brought a new energy and dynamism not only to Canada but to the relationship between our nations. We have a common outlook on the world, and I have to say I have never seen so many Americans so excited about the visit of a Canadian Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. Scotty, describe the vibe in Washington this week.
You know, the vibe is phenomenal. There's so much excitement. Pennsylvania Avenue and the ceremonial route is full of Canadian flags. For anybody that loves Canada, as I do, Americans that really pay attention to Canada, it's special. And that clip you just played, I was on the South Lawn of the White House when the president said that. People had to show up at 6 o'clock in the morning, stand in line, clear security. But there was so much excitement, and it continues right through to today. He's still here. I can't believe the energy of this prime minister, to be honest. I mean, I'm pretty tired, and I didn't have to stand in front of the world and perform. And I think he's already on his 4th event today. I just left him over at the Mayflower Hotel earlier today, Steve, to come see you. So it's just remarkable.
James, does this indicate anything more than the fact that, you know, Prime Minister Trudeau is a young, dashing-looking fellow in the most important capital city in the world?
Well, I think there's an element of that, but I think as well, Mr. Trudeau falls in line with a lot of images and perceptions that Americans have of Canada, a country that is similar but also progressive and willing to do elements in foreign policy, such as a humanitarian work that sometimes is a little bit more difficult to get consensus on within the states. But in terms of the vibe and in terms of the excitement, I think you also see a lot of sort of the Canadian-American contingent within Washington on the outskirts and within the events of the last few days. Scotty's right; it's been a whirlwind a week with lots of events. You see a lot of renewed pride and a renewed sense of making Canada matter in the hearts of and in the minds of politicians and legislators here in Washington.
Well, that's what I'm really trying to figure out, Scotty. Is this anything more than sort of typical American fascination with celebrity, or is this really about Canada-U.S. relations? What do you think?
I think it's really about making progress, not just on Canada-U.S. relations, but on big global issues that matter. So it's both bilateral and it's also multilateral. And, you know, it's interesting because earlier today we buried the First Lady of the United States, Nancy Reagan, and you started by talking about the Reagan-Mulroney relationship. And remember, it wasn't just the Shamrock Summit when Irish eyes are smiling. It was also that they made significant progress on the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, expanding into NAFTA, but also on things like acid rain. So this week, a lot of progress has been made on issues that people barely ever talk about, things that are near and dear to my heart as a policy nerd. Regulatory cooperation is being institutionalized. That is gigantic. The pre-clearance agreement between Canada and the United States that is going further than the United States than we have with any other country in the world. And that's just two of the subjects that they covered in their bilateral meeting and in their press conference. And I think they're trying to make the most of their time together, to be honest. The president is very committed to his legacy. They're both very interested in making progress in the fight against climate change. And so we're going to see a flurry of activity that has been given a boost of adrenaline in the last couple of days, but will continue right through the North American Leaders Summit and as long as possible. And I would argue, Steve, it'll continue even when President Obama is no longer in the White House. But this relationship is real, and their commitment on issues is obvious for anybody who is watching them carefully. So this is the beginning of a whole new era in not just Canada-U.S. relations, but the way Canada and the United States conquer world issues together.
I would, though, Scotty, while you've got the floor, like to follow up with this. And I want to put this visit into some kind of historical perspective because this isn't your first rodeo either. And, you know, we did have Clinton and Chrétien before this one, and we did have Reagan and Mulroney before this one. You know, in fact, you can keep going back. We had JFK and Lester B. Pearson once upon a time. These aren't the first two presidents and prime ministers who've actually gotten along famously, but I wonder if you could put the two of them, Trudeau and Obama, into some kind of historical context.
So you're saying I'm old. I'll do my best.
I don't think I was saying that, but okay.
The bilateral relationship, the leaders' relationship that I have the most familiarity with is President Clinton and Prime Minister Chrétien, since I worked for the first President Clinton, I should say. And, you know, they liked to golf together, and they talked on the phone, and they met together on the margins of multilateral meetings, and they liked each other a lot. What's interesting about this relationship between Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Obama is it's really clear that Mr. Obama sees himself in Mr. Trudeau, and what has taken it to another level is the family bonds. I mean, it's not just the two guys, but it's also the spouses and the kids. And once you involve your family in something, that's the beginning of something that's much bigger than just the issues. It's much bigger than the business relationship. You know, Prime Minister Harper and President Obama had a very business-like relationship. And by the way, it wasn't all bad. You know, they made progress on the Beyond the Border initiative. They instituted the Regulatory Cooperation Council that just got another boost here yesterday. So, but what has happened and what is happening, I think, is there's a level of familiarity. There's a sense of humor. The toasts last night were hilarious, and the fact that they can kind of poke fun, and they're both young, new generation leaders, and that Barack Obama sees himself in Justin Trudeau, that's new. That's brand new, I think, to this relationship. And importantly, what Prime Minister Trudeau wants to do is take that chemistry and apply it to issues that really matter. And so we'll see if he can do that, but I think he's got a very good start.
Well, that's where I want James to pick up on the story. It's terrific that they're getting along so well and they've bonded, etc. But I'm sure Canadians want to know, James, whether or not we can therefore conclude that there's going to be advancements in policy as a result. What are you hearing so far?
There were significant announcements yesterday, but they entail a lot of follow-through. The announcement on an Arctic partnership is a big one in terms of what the Americans have said they want this to look like. It's been in the works for a number of years now on their side. And as the Americans have designed it, it really is looking at Arctic development and the critical questions of the Arctic through a scientific and environmental lens. That's not something that's been at the top of Canadian decision-making. The other element is Indigenous governance and where they fit in large-scale decision-making. Rearranging that is going to take a lot of work and a lot of follow-through and a lot of analysis down the road. It's interesting just to tag that onto the celebrity question. I mean, in the lead up to the state dinner yesterday, some of the major media outlets here in Washington on their websites, Politico, The Hill, in the Washington Post, there wasn't very much in terms of, there wasn't very much coverage on, you know, what impact is this going to have on the material relationship between the two countries. I think that most people expect here that it'll take some time before we get a sense of the trade-offs and how the relationship is changing in a real structural way.
Scotty, I want to read you something that Tony Clement, who's of course a former cabinet minister in Stephen Harper's old government, here's what he had to say about whether or not the new relationship between the two of these leaders is actually going to pay off in the end for either country. He said, President Obama is at the end of his term. He will not get things from Congress. He will not get things done through executive action. So for the Liberals to suggest that they're going to have a real strategy on climate change with President Obama is pure fiction, and Canadians will not buy it. I'd like your reaction to that observation.
Well, Steve, I have a lot of respect for Tony Clement. That having been said, the last time I checked, he's not a U.S. constitutional scholar. And the truth is, President Obama can get a lot done through executive action. But not only that Prime Minister Trudeau was really smart to see congressional leaders on his visit here. So 10 months is a long time. I can remember people in your country talking about how long your campaign was this last round, and it was a lot shorter than 10 months. So again, I realize that it's the job of the opposition to take shots, and perhaps he needs to say that, but I don't think it's fair, a fair observation to say that nothing will occur and that the President of the United States doesn't have authority. It's true our systems are different, and it's true that Congress is relevant, but it's also true that there are a lot of things, particularly on clean air, clean water, and regulatory alignment, and how you run the border, that are done strictly through executive action, and they made a lot of progress on that this week.
All right, James, let me follow up with you on an issue that was certainly quite controversial during the election campaign last October, and that is the whole issue of ISIS in the Middle East. Prime Minister Trudeau has changed the policy. We no longer have CF-18s dropping bombs over there. He's got a different process in place, and I'm wondering whether you've heard whether that has caused any friction behind the scenes in any parts of the American government.
The only thing I noted of interest was that in terms of military, that type of issue, was the head of Lockheed Martin being one of the guests on the American side at the state dinner last night. But that, that's just a major, industrial company in both countries. I think that people forget in this relationship that President Obama is someone who has always talked about the value of diplomacy and the importance of humanitarian work in international relations, and the role of Canada as not necessarily being at the forefront of the combat element of the mission, is probably one that aligns with his own beliefs as what should happen in the region. And certainly there's been a lot of talk about bringing Canada back to a sort of traditional, maybe not traditional, but a role that's been used many times before, where we're doing the kinds of things that are in line with overall American ambitions, but not necessarily taking the same actions they are. It's probably a role that, in his own knowledge and understanding of Canadian foreign policy, is one that President Obama is familiar with. So there hasn't been, to be quite honest, a lot of talk about the mission being any type of real friction between the two of them.
Okay, James, let me do.
Steve,
Go ahead, Scotty. Sure.
I'm sorry, if I could just jump in on that for a second, because James just reminded me of something to the point. It's not. While it is, you described it as a bromance, Steve, and I think Trudeau-Obama is trending on Twitter, or was yesterday. There is still a negotiation. There is still a dance back and forth. And so the fact James mentioned that the head of Lockheed Martin was at the dinner could perhaps be read as a signal that the U.S. is committed to things like the Joint Strike Fighter, notwithstanding where Canada and other countries are in that. It's a bigger signal, of course. But so the U.S. has things at once from Canada that are very much part of the daily negotiation back and forth. Canada, for its part, really wants to make progress, wants to make on things like softwood lumber, to make sure that dispute doesn't reemerge. And so you saw an announcement this week that the two countries are committed to a deadline to report back on progress on softwood lumber, so that it doesn't become, honestly, the next keystone, the next sort of negative issue that divides us and defines the relationship. And I can tell you, in talking to people, senior officials in the Obama administration, just in the last 72 hours, that negotiation was really tough. The Canadians pushed really hard on that. They knew they needed to come home from this trip with something to say about softwood, and short of doing a deal, an extension on the last agreement, they came up with something serious. So both sides still have cards to play. They still have chips on the table, and there will be a lot of back and forth before this is all over.
Okay. James, I guess one of the questions I've had emailed to me from a number of people is, this is the first state dinner in nearly 2 decades. How come it hasn't happened before this?
Well, I think there is an element of seeing the world in the same way that allows for these types of events to take place, or creates the desire on the American side to have them. And certainly President Obama, being at the end of his second term, wants to create the type of excitement around the initiatives that'll be his legacy, like climate. And as Scotty said, he certainly sees in Trudeau, someone very similar to him. In terms of the overlap between the two governments, between different administrations, it hasn't at least in the last 7 or 10 years, or 8 years rather, there hasn't always been sort of two prime ministers and a prime minister to president who have been seeing the world in the same way. So I think it's just about the opportunity and the right timing.
Okay, Scotty, let me read something that John Ivison had in the National Post the other day and get you to comment on that. John said, even during this time of accord, the Americans are never reticent about pursuing their interests. The Trudeau government must be similarly single-minded, even when faced with strong personal connections. The U.S. may be as staunch a friend as Canada will ever have, but no ally is eternal, while our interests are eternal and perpetual. The reality is that Obama is leaving soon, and Trudeau is just getting started. I know that our Prime Minister sort of punted this question very skillfully during the press conference yesterday, but I do want to ask you your thoughts on this. If a Republican candidate wins the election in November, the expectation is that all these hosannas are going to come to an end. Does the party end if that's the case?
That'll be worth the price of admission. The Prime Minister talked about it a little bit today at the lunch earlier today at the Center for American Progress, the idea that you just have to deal with whoever, the cards that are dealt to you. And he talked about how, and he talked in his campaign, to be honest, about the massive scale of the Canada-U.S. relationship. So whether it's on commercial issues or shared defense, the NORAD agreement that we have, or on environmental issues, the International Joint Commission, which has been around for 50 years, as has NORAD, this relationship is large, huge, and integrated. So while the personal connection between the leaders matters and can help a lot and can set the tone and can allow some great new innovation in how we treat each other, it's not the end-all and be-all. The relationship is too big, too integrated, too much going on, too much history for it to be bound up only in personality. It just will be really interesting to see what happens in our election, notwithstanding our relations with people around the world. I was in Europe 2 weeks ago with a global meeting, actually, of the law firm, and my partners around the world are more flipped out than even Americans at the notion that we might elect somebody like the guy who's currently the front runner. So this is a bigger issue. I think the United States is a little bit in denial, at least I am, and the rest of the world is completely flipping about it.
Well, all right, Scotty, I got to follow up on that then. I know you've already sort of dropped a little hint earlier that the former President Clinton was just the first of 2 Clinton presidencies that you expect for your country. But having said that, Justin Trudeau famously said in that 60 Minutes piece that, he's not about building walls, and we know that Donald Trump is a voracious consumer of media, so we have to assume he's already heard that line. And it would be pretty tough for anybody to convince me anyway, and I suspect most Canadians, that a Donald Trump presidency and a Justin Trudeau prime ministership would be as bromantic as what we've been seeing over the past couple of days in Washington. Surely that will matter, won't it?
Yeah, it'll matter. It won't be as bromantic, perhaps, but Canada will continue to pursue its interests regardless of who the prime minister is. The U.S. Would pursue its interests. It'll be totally different. The joke that's going around is that if Donald Trump's elected president, that Canada will build a wall to keep him in the U.S. and they'll make him pay for it. So, it'll be different. But I think it's a little early. We are still here. We're still basking in the glow of this incredible visit. We've got a good 10 months to see what kind of progress we can make. And in that period of time, there may be an independent candidate that emerges. There may be a contested convention in Cleveland where the Republicans try to knock off Trump, depending on how Ohio and Florida go. So there is just a long, long road before we all start worrying about whether or not Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau can get along. I think it's way premature for that, to be honest.
Ain't that the truth? Scotty Greenwood and James Munson, it's really good of both of you to join us from our studio there in front of the gorgeous Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, you two.
Thanks a lot, Steve. See you next time.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.